Dr. Sage here. Welcome back. This is video number 4 out of 5 where we learn about aerobic cellular respiration. Where we left off last time, glucose has been broken all the way down to carbon dioxide, releasing all of its energy. But we've barely made any ATP so far. We've only made 4 total ATPs. Where most of the energy is currently stored is in the reduced electron carriers, NADH and FADH2. Turns out your cells don't really like those batteries. So what we're going to do is we're going to take all these charged up batteries that we made and feed them into the last step, the third main stage of aerobic cellular respiration, which is called oxidative phosphorylation. Oxidative phosphorylation is made up of 2 parts, the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. Through this process, the cell is going to make about 28 more ATP. All right, so let's begin learning about oxidative phosphorylation. The first step of oxidative phosphorylation is called the electron transport chain. So currently, we have these reduced electron carriers, NADH and FADH2. They're carrying a lot of energy by carrying electrons. What they're going to do is they're going to give away their electrons to a set of proteins embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, and those proteins are called the electron transport chain. So NADH is going to give its electrons away to this protein that will turn it into the dead battery, NAD+. Same thing with FADH2, give away its electrons, turns that into the dead battery, FAD. Now what's going to happen is the electrons are going to pass from one protein in the electron transport chain to the next protein, to the next protein, to the next protein, to the next protein. The reason the electrons are flowing through this electron transport chain is because as they pass from one protein to the next, those electrons give away a little energy. Recall that electrons carry energy and they can carry different amounts of energy. So as they pass from one to another, they give away a little energy. Pass from this one to the next one, give away a little more energy. Pass from this one to the next one, they give away a little more energy. That energy is going to be used, it's going to be captured, but not yet to make ATP. What the energy is going to be used for is active transport, to pump hydrogen ions, which are protons, from a low concentration in the matrix to a high concentration in the intermembrane space. So the hydrogen ions don't like that. Remember, they want to go from high concentration to low concentration. You're making them go from low to high concentration, so that requires energy. That energy is coming from these electrons. Now these electrons are flowing through this electron transport chain, and you want them to keep flowing through the electron transport chain so you can keep pumping hydrogen ions. But there's a bit of a problem with that, because as they're flowing through here, they can't stay with this last protein of the electron transport chain. If they stayed here, it would be like a traffic jam and no more electrons could flow through. So the electrons need somewhere to go. And that explains why you're breathing in oxygen right now. The only reason you need oxygen is because oxygen is the final electron acceptor of this electron transport chain. In other words, it's the thing that's going to take the electrons from the electron transport chain. So the oxygen you're breathing in right now, your cells are combining that oxygen with electrons and protons and turning it into water. Not because you really need a lot more water, but because you need somewhere for those electrons to go. Okay, so that's the whole reason you need oxygen, because you need somewhere for your electrons to go. So oxygen is the final electron acceptor of the electron transport chain. Now, these hydrogen ions that you pumped from the matrix to the intermembrane space, they don't like that. Remember, due to their electrochemical gradient, they want to go back from here to here into the matrix where there's a low concentration. However, since they're an ion, they're hydrophilic and they will not pass through the phospholipids. The only way they could cross from one side to the other, from the intramembrane space to the matrix, would be if there's a protein that would let them cross from one side to the other. And it turns out there is a protein. It's called ATP synthase. ATP synthase lets hydrogen ions flow from the high concentration in the intermembrane space to the low concentration in the matrix. But when they flow through this protein, okay, that's a source of energy. This protein, ATP synthase, actually spins like a turbine, okay, due to the hydrogen ions flowing through it. And when it's spinning like a turbine, what it does is it takes ADP that has 2 phosphates and it takes another phosphate, and that spinning forces them together, and that turns it into ATP. So this is how you make ATP, and this is how you make most of your ATP. Remember, glycolysis only makes 2 ATP, citric acid cycle only makes 2 ATP, oxidative phosphorylation makes about 28 ATP. So this step is called chemiosmosis. So this is an example of chemiosmosis, the use of energy in a proton gradient, a lot of protons here and not a lot here, to drive cellular work, in this case the work to make ATP. Now there's a name for this proton gradient, and the fact that it wants to do work, we call it proton motive force. So hydrogen ions are protons. The protons want to move, so that's motive, and when they move from one side to the other, there's a force behind it, and that force is used to make ATP. So putting those two together, the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis, the two together, those are called oxidative phosphorylation, which is the third main stage of aerobic cellular respiration. So what happened prior to oxidative phosphorylation is you made all of these reduced electron carriers, the NADHs and the FADH2s. They were made inside the matrix of the mitochondria, for example, through the citric acid cycle. These reduced electron carriers, they're charged up batteries. They're carrying energy by carrying extra electrons. They're now going to give away their energy by giving away their electrons to the proteins of the electron transport chain that are embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Okay, remember the mitochondria is two membranes, an inner membrane and an outer membrane. The electron transport chain is going to pass the electrons from one protein to the next. As these electrons are passed, they're releasing energy. That energy is used for active transport to pump hydrogen ions or protons from a low concentration in the matrix to a high concentration in the intermembrane space. You keep pumping the hydrogen ions across from one side to the other. The electrons need somewhere to go in the end. Where they go is to oxygen. Electrons combine with oxygen and hydrogen ions to create water. So oxygen is a final electron acceptor of the electron transport chain. That's why you need oxygen. Where you need oxygen is inside the matrix of the mitochondria. So now you have a lot of hydrogen ions out here in the intermembrane space, not a lot here in the matrix. They don't like that. They want to go back across, and they're allowed to go back across by passing through this protein called ATP synthase. When they flow through this protein, it causes a phosphate to attach to an ADP to turn it into an ATP. Okay, so this whole process is called oxidative phosphorylation, which is made up of the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. And that's the third main stage of aerobic cellular respiration. Let's back up. Let's go to the big picture of aerobic cellular respiration. Energy is starting out in glucose, or the food you ate. Glucose is in the food you ate. That energy, where most of it is going, is to the reduced electron carrier, NADH. From there, where most of the energy goes, is the electron transport chain. From there, that energy goes to create proton motive force. And from there, finally in the end, the energy is going to make ATP. From one molecule of glucose through aerobic cellular respiration, you make about 32 ATP molecules. So one more time, the big picture. Okay, remember this is the first big picture I showed you when we were beginning to learn about aerobic cellular respiration. Now it should start to make a lot more sense. So we start with a molecule of glucose. We do a process called glycolysis that happens in the cytoplasm, not in the mitochondria. Glycolysis takes glucose, it's spelled out of 6 carbons, breaks it in half into 2 molecules, which will now each have 3 carbons. Those 2 3-carbon molecules are called pyruvate. Since it's breaking something down, it's also going to be releasing energy. That energy is going to be captured to charge up some batteries. 2 NADH molecules and 2 net ATP molecules. Remember, it's 2 net because you have to spend 2 to get 4. Then you end with pyruvate. Pyruvate is still storing a lot of energy. You now take these 2 molecules of pyruvate and bring it into the mitochondria. In the mitochondria, in particular in the matrix of the mitochondria, you do pyruvate oxidation. That will turn pyruvate into acetyl-CoA. Along the way, you'll release 2 molecules of carbon dioxide as waste. You're breathing that out right now. Since you're breaking it down, you're also going to be releasing energy. That energy is used to charge up 2 NADH molecules. Then the acetyl-CoA feeds into the citric acid cycle. That's going to complete the breakdown of what started out as glucose all the way down to carbon dioxide. Since it's breaking it down, it's going to be releasing energy. That energy is going to be captured to charge up batteries. 6 NADHs, 2 FADH2s, and 2 ATPs. Remember, citric acid cycle starts with the 2-carbon acetyl-CoA combined with a 4-carbon oxaloacetate to make the 6-carbon citrate. So that's the first step. The next 7 steps take citrate and break it back down into oxaloacetate. That's what makes it a cycle. The thing you start with is the thing you end with. Now you have all of these charged up batteries, these reduced electron carriers. You feed them to the third main stage, oxidative phosphorylation, which is made up of the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. And through that process, you make about 28 ATP. So in total, you make about 32 ATP from one glucose molecule through aerobic cellular respiration. Okay, now, if you've noticed, everything I've said so far has been saying you're taking the energy from glucose, which is pure sugar. You're probably very well aware that you do not just get your energy by eating pure sugar. So you get your energy by the food you eat. You can get energy by eating simple carbohydrates, pure sugar like glucose, but you can also get energy by eating other things like fat molecules or proteins. So if that's the case, how do we make ATP if we're not starting with glucose, with pure sugar? Let's say that instead of eating a meal that was high in carbs, you ate a meal that was high in fat. Recall that fat, what that molecule actually is a triglyceride, which is made of 2 smaller types of molecules, glycerol and fatty acids. Well, if you eat a meal that contains fat, your body can break down that fat into glycerol, and then glycerol can be turned into one of the intermediate chemicals, one of the chemicals in the 10 steps of glycolysis. And then you can take that glycerol, enter it into glycolysis, and then make ATP. The other part of the triglyceride or fat molecule is fatty acids. So you can take those fatty acids and enter them into the citric acid cycle. Okay, turn it into acetyl-CoA to enter it into the citric acid cycle, and then use that to make ATP. So you don't actually have to start with glucose or carbs. You could eat a meal that contains fat and then use this pathway to make ATP. Or let's say that instead you ate a meal that was high in protein. Recall that proteins are made up of chains of amino acids. That protein is broken down into the amino acids, and then some of those amino acids can be turned into those intermediate chemicals to go through and make ATP. So that's how you can get energy from things that are not just carbohydrates. You don't have to just start with glucose to get your energy. The other thing to note about this pathway, if you notice, these arrows, like this arrow here, are going in both directions. Okay, so let's say that you did eat a meal that was high in carbs, but you're not about to go for a run, you're about to go to sleep. So you don't need a lot of ATP right now. Well, your body is not going to waste that energy. It's not going to just throw it away. It's going to store it. Okay, so one of the ways you can store it, take that high carb meal, and instead of making ATP, turn it into glycerol and fatty acids and store it on your body as fat. Okay, so all these pathways can go in both directions. Now, the other thing to note about these pathways is that you need to have the ability to make ATP when you need it, because obviously there are times where you need ATP. But you don't want to go through all of this process to start with glucose and go through all of this to make ATP if you don't need it. This is literally dozens of chemical reactions. There's a lot of time, effort, and work to make ATP if you don't need it right now. So we want to have a way of making ATP when we need it, but stop making it when we don't need it. Okay, there is a way that your cell does that, and that's something we learned in a prior chapter. That's called negative feedback, or feedback inhibition, or end product inhibition. So in this pathway, the end product, the thing that's being made, is ATP. Well, if you start to make too much ATP, what happens is ATP feeds back and is an allosteric inhibitor for one of the first enzymes in glycolysis. The enzyme is called phosphofructokinase. It's just fun to say. You should try it a few times. Phosphofructokinase. So if you start to make too much ATP, it feeds back and it shuts off phosphofructokinase, which means it stops this pathway. So you stop making ATP because you don't need it right now. If you're making a lot of ATP, what that also means is you're making a lot of citrates. Remember, this is the first thing you make in the citric acid cycle. Well, it turns out citrate is also an allosteric inhibitor for phosphofructokinase. So two different ways you can turn off this pathway if you have too much ATP. Now let's say you have the opposite problem. You don't have enough ATP. Okay, if you don't have a lot of ATP, what that means is you have a lot of ADP, and although we don't talk about it much in Bio 1, that means you also have a lot of AMP. So if you don't have enough of this, you'll have a lot of this. Well, it turns out that AMP is an allosteric activator. It turns on phosphofructokinase. So if you don't make enough ATP, AMP turns on the system to start making more ATP. Okay, so you regulate your aerobic cellular respiration through negative feedback, which we learned about in a prior lecture. Okay, so that concludes our coverage of aerobic cellular respiration, where using 1 molecule of glucose, you can make about 32 ATP. But there's a problem with aerobic cellular respiration. The problem is it requires oxygen. You can't do it without oxygen. Now, some organisms don't have access to oxygen, and they need ATP to live. So they instead will use a process called fermentation. And fermentation we're going to discuss in our next lecture. So until then, this has been Dr. Sage.